Welcome, and thanks for tuning into KBRA podcasts. We cover topical research discussions, industry commentary, and more. In today's episode, Joan Feldbaum-Vidra, KBRA's Managing Director and Head of Sovereign Ratings, will discuss China's debt, investor exposure, and Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, global risks. She would also explain why direct risks from China's indebtedness are still contained and how the BRI debt contracts and the nature of lending increases global risks. Stay tuned to learn more.
Greetings, and I'm happy to join you for this latest Sovereign podcast episode. Today, we will speak about China and its impact on global sovereign risk. We'll cover a few related topics that we feel are important for global investors. First, we will discuss China's debt overhang. We'll discuss the international holdings of Chinese debt and why, in some ways, financial markets may be insulated in direct terms from risk of a hard landing in China. In indirect terms, however, the risks are higher. Second, we will turn to China's imperial ambitions and discuss how China's One Belt, One Road initiative, commonly known as OBOR or the BRI, causes a deterioration in sovereign risk across the globe. We'll talk about the nature of Chinese financing, the debt contracts, and also the nature of the investments, and how all of this ties into geopolitical global risks. So let's get started. First, China's debt overhang and what it means for global investors. According to data from the Bank for International Settlements, as of the end of Q3 2020, China's debt rose to a whopping 285% of GDP. That's really a mammoth amount for an emerging market economy. It's about 50% higher than for many others. In addition, that jump happened in just a decade and a half. China's aggregate debt almost doubled from 140% of GDP at the time of the global financial crisis. Let's think of this also in relative terms compared to other emerging markets with similar income levels. China's per capita income level in PPP terms, purchasing power parity terms, it's about $16,000. China is firmly a middle-income country. Now let's compare that to Brazil, for example. It has a per capita income level of about $14,000 in PPP terms, not too far from China, but its debt load stood at around 180% of GDP at the end of the third quarter 2020, a full 100% of GDP lower than China's. Colombia has a per capita income of about $14,000, but debt at the end of the third quarter of just 132% of GDP. Mexico, $18,000 in per capita GDP, debt load of 90% in aggregate for the entire economy. I think you see where we're going here. China has a lot of debt. Now, not all this debt, in fact, a small amount, is direct government debt. Now, the breakdown is interesting. Government debt isn't really the problem, at least in direct terms, nor is household debt. Each stand at about 60% of GDP. The bulk of the debt is owed by the non-financial corporate sector, and many of those companies are state-owned entities. So beginning in about 2018, things started to change in China. The government became less and less comfortable about its indebtedness. Preceding that, private entities started to default. That was the bulk of default. But then the state-owned entities started defaulting, and this was by the design of the policymaking community. We only know a little bit about what happened because the bulk of the distress wasn't actually registered as defaults. Many problem loans didn't actually get to headlines. They were renegotiated ahead of becoming registered as defaulted assets. There was an incentive to do that because of low recovery rates, so it made sense for creditors to renegotiate those loans. So, the government of China has been slowly pricking this debt bubble and allowing defaults even among state-affiliated concerns. How does this affect global investors? Well, investors inside of China are smarting. They're feeling the pain. But non-resident investors, not so much. Still very decoupled. We've all been reading about the money flowing into China. That's true. Chinese bonds are being added to global indices such as the Bloomberg Barclays Global Bond Index and Bond Connect. That's a program that gives foreigners access to China bonds through Hong Kong. Chinese government bonds will also be able to be included in the Russell FTSE World Bond Index. But for now, non-residents hold just 3% of Chinese government bonds. That's about $300 billion. Not really enough to shake the financial system across the globe. But the story doesn't end just on direct risks. The indirect risks are formidable. All one has to think about is the systemic importance of China to the global economy to know that that is the case. So the bottom line here is that risks are contained due to the low non-resident holdings of Chinese government bonds, but global risks are quite high should defaults spiral. It's an important differentiation. Now, let's move on to the second topic. How has China's BRI negatively impacted global risk? So what is the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative? Well, it's probably the most ambitious infrastructure project the world has ever seen. It was formally launched in 2013, and it has mobilized billions of dollars in capital thus far, perhaps even more. It's really hard to know. There's no ledger, and there's very minimal transparency, all by design. BRI creates a vast network of railways, energy pipelines, highways, stretching basically to all continents of the world. The BRI is the focal point of Chinese foreign policy. It's actually enshrined in the Constitution. So now that we know about BRI, let's get to why the BRI is negative to global economics. After all, it brings tons of money to countries in need of capital and investment, right? Well, that's probably overly simplistic. There are three main reasons why. The first has to do with exposure. China has supplanted the Paris Club countries as the world's most important bilateral creditor. China now commands a seat at the table. Not so bad? Well, that depends on your perspective. China is not the most welcome guest at the dinner party. Also, there's so little transparency about China's loans through the BRI. And that's a problem to Paris Club countries because they also have debt outstanding to these debtor countries. What you can say is that bilateral creditors, Paris groups of creditors, and other creditors are blindsided to some extent. I don't think we need to say more about why that negatively impacts global risks. Second, let's cover terms. Compared to past bilateral credit, Chinese loans under the BRI are expensive. And let's think about that in terms of the countries that are being lent to. The reason why infrastructure is not developed in those target countries is because, guess what? They couldn't afford it. So that's the situation. China is lending on a very expensive terms to countries whose baselines are more fragile. And how are these loans expensive? And how are they onerous? Well, they're onerous in terms of rates, they're onerous in terms of repayment structures, and they're also problematic in terms of covenants. Very different than what was the situation in the past. In the past, lending to many of these countries was extended on very affordable terms through international financial institutions, usually with a heavy grant component and largely concessional, always in terms that were purposely intended to be manageable for the debtor. A lot was granted simply as aid. Well, what's the situation now? Bam! COVID has hit these countries hard, and these loans are not easy to pay back. And what are some other terms that are problematic? Well, these BRI loans all have cross-default clauses. That's not unique, but the ones in the BRI loans are very harsh and extremely expansive. Loans can be pulled for a variety of infringements, basically an unfettered ability to exercise cross-defaults beyond simply for non-repayment of loans in these so-called muscular contracts. Anything virtually can trigger cross-default clauses in these contracts. And lastly, let's just talk about expanse. Where's this money going? Well, some of it's going to coal-fired plants in Pakistan, investments that will make those countries more fragile down the road, especially considering heightened stakeholder concerns about environmental impacts. And where else? Ports. Lots of ports. And you have to think about that in terms of China's naval ambitions on top of its commercial ambitions. Ports are strategic for commerce, but also are strategic for militaries. And what else can we say about expanse? Well, a lot of the investments are in 5G, telecom, cables underwater, not just in brick-and-mortar infrastructure. So, to repeat that, China's looking to make its mark in maritime and next-generation technology. Well, that's a wrap. I hope this podcast shines some light on why KBRA sovereigns spend so much time thinking about China's ascendance and how it affects global risks and the global investment environment. Thank you very much for listening.
This concludes our episode. Please continue the conversation on LinkedIn and Twitter @CrowBondRating. We'd also like to remind you that all of our ratings and research reports are free at KBRA.com. Lastly, please share your ideas for future podcast episodes or any feedback to media@KBRA.com. We hope to see you next time.